There is a monthly event in my town for modular synth users. I wanted to perform at this event, but I only had 3 semi-modular units, a Moog Mother 32, a Moog DFAM, and a Make Noise No Coast. I didn't feel like my 3 units alone would be enough for a performance, but I also had a drum module that allowed sampling. So I thought I'd create some drum sounds on my DFAM and then load samples into my drum module. I figured since all my sounds would have originated from the DFAM and I wouldn't be using any factory preset samples, that I might be allowed to perform at the event and not be accused of cheating. So, first off, I fiddled with the knobs and patch bay on my DFAM to create some interesting kick, snare, and hi-hat sounds, along with some sound effects. For recording, I had planned to use Audacity because that program is so simple. But for some reason, my computer never picked up a signal with Audacity, but it did with Ableton Live. That probably ended up being a better choice because it allowed fast and precise control over trimming, and Live had a couple of nice EQ tools that I used on the kick and hi-hat sounds. Some sounds, especially the kick drums, ended up with a discernible note, so I used an online piano to make sure everything was tuned to F. I also made some loops, and I used an app on my phone to make sure those loops were set to 130 beats per minute. Going in, I knew that a crucial limitation on my drum module was that sample file names could only be 6 characters long. 6 characters, really. So I developed a file naming scheme and made notes and a list for myself so that when I would one day in the future go back to these files, I'd understand what the hell I meant by naming a sample PSN005. I assumed I'd be able to use Ableton Live's export audio function, selecting individual tracks, but I never could figure that part out, so instead I just browsed for the sample files that Live had created, copied them to a separate folder, truncated the file names, and used VLC to convert Ableton's AIFF files to WAV files. Samples get loaded into the drum module via an SD card. The card has a little switch on the side that locks it, and that switch would get pushed to the lock position every time I inserted it, so I had to tape over it to the unlocked position. This drum module has received criticism for its difficult interface and the fact that it only has 4 buttons to navigate a tiny screen. I agree they could have done a lot better design job back in 2014 when they released it, but for me the interface was a minor irritation, and poking around the menu via trial and error was much faster than if I'd tried to read the manual. When I first played back my samples, they didn't sound at all the same as I'd created them. Then I noticed the slots I'd loaded the samples into had preset reverb applied. Once I'd removed the reverb, everything sounded exactly like my originals. The available pre-named slots didn't match with the samples I had. For example, only 2 slots were reserved for snare, and I had 7 snare sounds. There were 6 tom slots, and I only had 2 tom sounds. This meant I'd have to put some of my bass drums, loops, or sound effects into slots assigned to ride cymbal or crash or some other pre-named slot. And to further complicate things, none of these slots corresponded to the triggers on my sequencer, which had labels like C forward, D reverse, and G sharp mixolydian. What that meant is that I needed not just a list, but a spreadsheet to keep track of all this stuff I've created. Despite the trouble, I am satisfied with the results of this process. I now know if I ever get lucky enough to discover some killer but impossible to recreate patch out of my modular gear, I'll be able to sample it and play it back.